Hi everyone, a quick comment before the episode starts. To keep making these episodes, we need your support.
Give us your subscriptions, your likes, your comments.
You're tired, you're poor, you're huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Nabilah?
No?
No, it's not that serious.
Wherever you're listening, please subscribe, like, leave a review.
Leave a comment, turn on that notification bell.
And definitely share.
But we do want the huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Thank you and enjoy today's episode. Hi everyone, this is the continuation of last week's episode. So if you haven't listened to that one, you may want to go back and listen before continuing with this one. We relied on several sources for this episode, including the Crisis Group, the Council on Foreign Relations, HumAngle, and Alexander Thurston's book titled Boko Haram, The History of an African Jihadist Movement. You'll find links to these sources in our episode description. From Triple E Media, I'm Rahmat Muhammad, and this is The Backstory. Between 2009 and 2014, the leadership of Boko Haram was in the hands of Abubakar Shekau. And during that period, his rule was based on terror. He was terrorizing not only the local communities, but even his own men. Anyone who did not bow to his interpretation of Islam was labeled an infidel and became a target. It was Shekau's way, or the highway. And under this reign of terror, the group became more powerful. They even seized Nigerian territory that they controlled. But the dynamics started to shift in 2015.
By 2015, Nigeria's security forces were on the offensive and had recovered territory from Boko Haram. Boko Haram was weak. In March 2015, the group pledged allegiance to the Islamic State, and they became the Islamic State West Africa Province, ISWAP.
So 2014-2015, Islamic State in Iraq and Syria actually emerged, and they declared a caliphate.
That's Abdulbasit Kassim, a PhD candidate at Rice University in the Department of Religion and a visiting doctoral fellow at Institute of Islamic Thought in Africa at Northwestern University.
And at that time, Boko Haram, what is known as Jama'at al-Islam Dawat Jihad, they've had a fracture in their relationship with Al-Qaeda at that time. So some of the leaders of Boko Haram, they convinced Shekau that he should declare his pledge of allegiance to the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. At that time, Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, they were receiving pledge of allegiance from other parts of the world, from Yemen, from Somalia, from Sinai in Egypt. So they also felt like, this would be a good PR for Jama'at al-Dawat Jihad, for them to also pledge their allegiance as well to Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So they actually did pledge their allegiance, and then the name of the group was rebranded from Jama'at al-Dawat Jihad to Islamic State West African Province. So they rebranded, and then this new movement, known as ISWAP at that time, was fully operating as an affiliate or a franchise of the global movement of Islamic State in Iraq and Syria.
But while this affiliation allowed Boko Haram to brand itself under a global jihadist movement, it didn't really seem to have any operational benefits. And for Shekau, it actually meant that he was demoted to the role of wali, or governor, of the West African province under the Islamic State. He was no longer his own boss.
And by August 2016, the Islamic State further demoted Shekau. The title of governor was given to Abu Musab al-Barnawi, a man widely believed to be Muhammad Yusuf's son. With the moral backings of Islamic State, leaders of Boko Haram like al-Barnawi and Nur started to publicly criticize Shekau and his violent approach against Muslim civilians. This opened an internal schism where two camps started to emerge, the Shekau camp and the al-Barnawi camp.
More disagreements started to emerge between the two camps, and it became clear that the Islamic State was supporting al-Barnawi's side. After the demotions in 2016, it must have been obvious to Shekau that he was not in the Islamic State's favor.
Now, what happened in 2016 when Abubakar Shekau had the friction with Abu Musa al-Barnawi and Imam al-Nur? What Shekau did, he left the ISWAP brand and he reverted back to his Jamaat al-Islam al-Dawat al-Jihad, which is Boko Haram. And that brand continued to bear the name Boko Haram, continued to bear the name Jamaat al-Islam al-Dawat al-Jihad. And ISWAP now started developing their own independent identity as an affiliate and franchise of Islamic State in West African province. Shekau, on the other hand, Jamaat al-Islam al-Dawat al-Jihad was operating as an independent entity without any affiliation to any of the global jihad movements.
The ISWAP faction now had to prove itself and distinguish itself from Boko Haram. And the next couple of years, from 2016 to now, ISWAP has been growing in both numbers and influence.
At least 30 military personnel have been killed in the night of Friday to Saturday following an attack by terrorist group Boko Haram. 67 soldiers from Niger and Nigeria were wounded during the attack.
Tensions and fears have gripped Niger's capital Niamey 5 days after Boko Haram insurgents launched attacks that left 26 people dead in the country's southeastern region of Bosso.
ISWAP's first major independent military operation was carried out on the 3rd of June 2016. They attacked a Nigerian base in Bozo, a town on Lake Chad close to the Nigerian border.
This first attack gave a glimpse into what would become ISWAP's style of operation: raiding targeted military bases, seizing weapons and supplies, and ensuring as few civilian casualties as possible.
On the other hand, Boko Haram continued its indiscriminate killings of both Muslim and Christians alike, raiding whole villages and abducting women and children.
It's important to keep in mind that the mission, the goals for ISWAP and Boko Haram are exactly the same. ISWAP, like Boko Haram, wants to establish territory in Nigeria or anywhere in West Africa, where the rule of God, the rule of Islam, is supreme. It wants an Islamic State.
In 2018, ISWAP carried out one of its biggest operations yet. The group kidnapped 110 girls from a school in Dapchi, Yobe State, on the evening of Monday the 19th of February.
This is the secondary school in Dapchi town, where militants came last Monday night and abducted 110 school children.
Nigeria says it plans to negotiate for the release of 110 girls abducted from a school in the northeastern town of Dapchi last month, rather than use a military operation to free them by force.
The girls were held in captivity for 29 days, and then over 100 of them were eventually released on the 21st of March after ISWAP warned them not to return to school.
It was an emotional moment for these girls from the town of Dapchi. They are free after more than 30 days in Boko Haram captivity.
The Minister of Information, Rahmat Muhammad, said the return of the girls follows negotiation by the government and its international partners. He, however, insisted that no ransom was paid and noted that the girls were released unconditionally.
Now, if you compare this to Boko Haram's Chibok girls kidnapping, it would appear like ISWAP was taking a softer approach. But the decision to release the girls was likely made by one man, and that man would lose his life over it.
Remember that Mama Nuru used to be third in command to Mohammed Yusuf. When he left Nigeria after Yusuf's death, Shekau became number 1. And ever since 2009, Mama Nur has sort of been this behind-the-scenes right-hand man, but he was never really the main man, the main leader.
Even after Boko Haram declared allegiance to ISIS, Mama Nur, who was older than al-Barnawi, contested for the role of governor of ISWAP. But his campaign was rejected because the Islamic State believed he lacked credibility and he had a lust for power. Instead, they nominated al-Barnawi.
Of course, Nur was not happy about his nomination. He insisted that al-Barnawi was too young to lead the movement. We don't really know for sure how old al-Barnawi was at the time, but he was believed to have been in his early 20s. So, anyway, at the time the Dapchi girls were kidnapped by ISWAP, the Nigerian government engaged a group to negotiate the release of the girls in exchange for a ceasefire. Mama Nur took it upon himself to engage in the negotiations without informing his superiors in the Islamic State.
And when they found out, Mama Nur was executed. The order for his execution came directly from Abubakar al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. Analysts suggest that Nur's men believed he was too soft and they were not comfortable with his style of leadership.
In March of 2019, ISWAP demoted al-Barnawi because he was also considered to be too moderate. The new guy appointed by ISIS, who goes by the name Ba Idrissa, is not so moderate.
Under Ba Idrissa, ISWAP became more like Boko Haram in terms of its attacks. Multiple reports of ISWAP abducting women and killing civilians in places like Chad and Niger began to surface. There was also public beheadings of humanitarian workers.
But unlike Boko Haram, ISWAP also used softer tactics to bring communities under its control. The group imposed taxes on agricultural production. They guaranteed the safety of locals and granted access to previously inaccessible places.
Now, since ISWAP was essentially operating in the same way and fighting for control over the same territory as Boko Haram, it was only a matter of time before the two groups clashed.
The ISWAP members, they wanted full control of the jihadi landscape in northeast Nigeria. And Shekau, our faction, was posing a challenge to that authority for them. So they had to go on rampage to subdue Jamaat al-Islam Dawat Jihad.
So that night in Sambisa Forest, when ISWAP fighters went looking for Shekau, they wanted him and his followers to surrender. But of course, he ran away.
After Shekau and his followers ran into the forest, they managed to evade being captured by ISWAP for about 5 days, but they were eventually found.
Capture Shekau. When they captured Shekau, they negotiated with Shekau that Shekau should come out and actually provide a statement to his followers. All of them should surrender and submit themselves to the sole authority of ISWAP. Shekau refused.
But were they really expecting him to actually surrender? Shekau had rebelled against all attempts made to bring him under control.
So at this moment, Shekau was faced with a choice: surrender or die. And for him, surrender is not an option.
The refusal of him to be policed was also the reason he died, was also the reason he never surrendered to his interlocutors in ISWAP. Rather, they chose the other option of detonating a suicide bomb and killing himself.
Boko Haram leader Abubakar Shekau is proclaimed dead. The Wall Street Journal, citing Nigerian intelligence on Friday, reported that Shekau died after he detonated a suicide vest during an ambush by his rival.
On May 21st, news outlets started to report Shekau's death. But many, including the Nigerian government, have taken the news with a pinch of salt.
Now, however, we must approach this information with caution, because as you are aware, this is not the first time it's been said that Shekau had been killed, only for him to resurface in some kind of audio or video to say that, look, he is still alive.
Now, the Nigerian army says it's investigating reports that Boko Haram leader Abubakar Shekau has either died or was seriously injured during a clash with a splinter group, the Islamic State in West African province ISWAP. Well, it's not the first time Shekau has been reported.
If the news is true that Shekau is dead and that it was due to ISWAP's offensive, then we have a lot of questions.
Will Shekau's faction fully surrender to ISWAP? Or will they temporarily surrender in order to rebuild and gain military strength and further separate themselves as a faction? Or will ISWAP even experience further schism as the jihadi landscape continues to evolve?
Well, I guess most of what we know is based on the information that is available. And
That's Murtala Abdullahi, a researcher and reporter with HumAngle.
from what we understand is that they have this relationship with Islamic State that they have huge interest in protecting. To what degree does the Islamic State have influence over the operation is something that we do not really know best, but we know that there's a level of influence in the activity.
We do know that ISWAP's strategy, especially their softer tactics, is going to be more problematic for the Nigerian government in the long term. The relationships that ISWAP is able to build with local communities allows them to establish the stronghold they need to sustain the insurgency.
And that's why there's been a lot of calls for the government to extend its reach really beyond the garrison towns, win hearts and minds, counter violent extremism, and in summary, focus a lot more on the non-kinetic aspect as well as the other law enforcement actions that have been taken in place.
The other thing that analysts can predict is that the next few months to a year will be a period of transition, where ISWAP is absorbing some of the Boko Haram groups into its organization.
There will be a lot of engagement in terms of both offensive and also in terms of attempts within the groups to either de-escalate or find a way to either incorporate each other or to work independently. And then so that it means that there will also be a just action that will continue. This is something that will most likely be much more clearer in the coming months.
And Nigerian security forces and humanitarian groups will face a different challenge, especially in areas that have a high concentration of IDP camps.
And so once you have ISWAP moving to areas where, for instance, we have had humanitarian activities, you have had security forces that have not had a lot of threats, so which means that they need to be on more alert now because the battlefield dynamics is now changing. Humanitarian actors will need to also be reviewed in terms of the security arrangement and safeguard mechanisms.
It's not clear this time if Nigeria will need to change its approach to ISWAP, given the potential involvement of the Islamic State. Does the solution now require more international cooperation?
So the affiliation is there, the relationship between them is there, but at the roots of the problem, it's a Nigerian problem. It's a sub-regional problem that can only be addressed at that sub-regional level. So it's organic solutions that are required, in-house solutions to address the problem. These are the most important and most significant actions that are needed.
One of the criticisms lobbied at Nigeria in terms of how the country has been dealing with Boko Haram is that we've been relying primarily on the use of force. And I think that was certainly true in the early years. That's the first 10 years from 2002 to 2012. But in the past 7 to 10 years, the government has been trying to extend its reach through humanitarian efforts and through attempts to improve the economic conditions of the Northeast.
But according to Alexander Thurston, author of Boko Haram, The History of an African Jihadist Movement, military operations and socio-economic development are not enough. He insists that the issue of politics must be confronted. According to him, there are difficult political decisions that need to be made which would require talking to Boko Haram, and now ISWAP.
But these groups fundamentally believe that the Nigerian state has no legitimacy. For them, Nigeria does not have a right to exist. How do you start a conversation with a group that fundamentally believes that you don't have a right to exist?
The rise of secularism was in response to the injustices that were being carried out in the name of religion. The rise of religious extremism is in response to the injustices being carried out in the name of secularism. The lesson here is that both ideologies are susceptible to corruption, and when one is corrupted, it gives room for the other one to rise. There is fundamentally nothing wrong with either religious or secular ideologies as foundations for nation states, But each has failed in the past, and each will continue to fail as long as there are human beings who keep using the ideologies to empower and enrich some people while denying rights to other people. It's not what you do, it's how you do it. It's not the ideologies, it's how they are applied. Let's say you have a religious state, and in that state, you say that only a handful of people, religious leaders, are considered qualified enough to dictate to the rest what they can and they can't do. Right then and there, you already have a problem because you've now concentrated power in the hands of a few, and of course, you've made education out of reach for the many. What do you think is going to happen? Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and since the uneducated class is more in number, they will eventually rise up, overthrow your religious state, and insist on a secular one. So now you have a secular state, and again, you decide that only a handful of people, this time Western educated people, are qualified enough to dictate to the rest what they should and shouldn't do. Again, you have the same problem. You've concentrated power in the hands of a few. You make quality education out of reach for the many. What do you think will happen now? The uneducated will rise up again using religious education because that was the only education they had access to, and they'll overthrow your secular state and insist on a religious state. So then you set up a religious state, and again, you decide that only a handful of people are qualified to rule and you deny education to the many. So you keep going around and around in circles, from religious to secular and back again. And all for two reasons: concentration of decision-making power in the hands of a few and denying education to the many. This means that for an ideology to have lasting power, it needs to expand decision-making to include more people, and it needs to provide education to the many. This also means that any ideology that has exclusion and exclusivity at the root will not last. So that brings us to the question, how do you start a conversation with a group that fundamentally believes that you don't have the right to exist? You don't. There is no conversation to be had. Instead, you focus your efforts and resources on getting education to as many people as possible and enabling everyone to participate in local governance. Whichever ideology is successful at doing that will win. The Backstory is brought to you by EE Media Productions. Production copyright 2021 EE Media Productions. If you enjoyed this episode of The Backstory and want to hear more, subscribe to our 234 Audio YouTube channel. Episodes of this podcast and our other podcasts can also be found on our website, 234audio.com, as well as Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. This episode of The Backstory was produced by Nabilah Usman, John Iwodi, Anthonieta Kalunta, Dominic Tabakaji, and Sam Tabakaji. Executive producer Rahmat Muhammad. Special thanks to Abdulbasit Kassim, Murtala Abdullahi, Rabia Hadejia, and Gbado Ikaleku. If you are interested in sponsoring this program, reach out to us at 0818-230-1234 or email us at info@234audio.com. I'm Rahmat Muhammad. See you next week.